What's going on, guys? Coach Phil here with Team P4P, and today we're going to be going over a quick case study with Vin Lee here, who is a 93 kg athlete, and how we got his 780 kg total all the way up to 862.5 kg total. All right, before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this program here, we have to look at it in terms of the strength approach and how growth is kind of measured. Growth in strength is a more logistic growth approach. So if you can see here, it starts out very fast and skews and then kind of evens out there. So for example, we'll take bench press. It's very quick for a lifter to go up to a 135 pound bench press and then perhaps even a 225 and then 315. But then it slowly starts to decay and drop off really fast, where growth starts to become where growth starts to slow down pretty heavily. Let's say like when we go from 315 pound bench to 405 pound bench. This also applies for the other lifts as well, whether that be the squat or the deadlift. Let's say deadlifting 600 to 700 pounds and then squatting from let's say 405 to 500 and then 500 to 600 pounds. So all those concepts apply there together. So yeah, in terms of where Ben is at, he had a 780 kilo total, which is still, fantastic for a 93 kilo lifter. So he was pretty much right about here, right? And then bringing it all the way up to 862.5 kg took a lot of in-depth, understanding the athlete, where their stimulus is, what frequency needs to be made, so that he can continue this rate of progression, even though, let's say our genetic ceiling is right here, right? So this is why it is important, let's say for lifters who are, let's say, more intermediate to advanced. You might see where a lot of lifters will take like cookie cutter programs online or like copy their friend's program, and they might run into a plateau despite doing everything their friend is doing. Their friend is, progressing very fast, but they're, kind of running into a wall or something like that. This is why it's kind of important to have a program that's curated to you, towards your leverages, optimizing what's, best for you in your growth. So going back to the program here, we're going to go and break it down pretty evenly in terms of squat, bench, and deadlift. So Ben here squats 332.5 kilos, which is roughly 733 pounds. But let's go ahead, dial back and kind of like what we looked like in terms of the squat there. So squats, we first started out, let's say, with 3 times squatting. In terms of like that 600 pound squat margin there, it was very rapid, right? So the 3 times squat, that volume, that frequency worked very well as we got up to the 600 pound mark. Once you hit to that low 600 pound mark, the growth kind of, I wouldn't say stagnant, but it wasn't as fast as we would like it to be in terms of like pushing towards that 700 pound mark. So eventually we switched that 3 times squatting to 2 times squatting. Reason being, the workload was much less. And of course, the weight that he was working with in terms of working sets on the secondary days and on the primary days was much higher. So the intensity was much higher, fatigue is also much higher, and then being able to rebound off that fatigue with the 2 times squat days gave us a lot more time in terms of our lower body rest compared to our 3 times squat, where if we had a squat day in the middle of the week, it would leak too hard into the primary. So we can first take a look at the squats here, specifically on our secondary day. As we can see, there's a top set of 4, followed by a 2x6, and then a higher percentage drop down. Typically for the squats, people who are kind of like built to squat, short femurs, for example, which happens to be a lot of Asian lifters, I like to give them a percentage top set or a percentage cap. Let's say we did ascending, kind of stop right here. I wouldn't go past 85%. So for example, here, 85%, what I mean is he had 82.5%, and this is taken by the primary day later on in the week here. So his primary day, he has a single at 302.5 kilos, and then his secondary day, he'll take 82.5%. For a lot of lifters, I would kind of stand in towards like the 75 to 87.5% margin. 82.5 is kind of our sweet spot, where he didn't have too much fatigue leaking into the primary, but the right amount of exposure needed so that we could still perform at our best come that time of 302.5. That 82.5%, that's something that I do for myself as well. I am self-coached, but let's say we had ascending squats, right? And we had ascending 4s, 5s, or 6s, depending on the primary work here. So let's say, for example, if the primary we had a triple or a double, I'll do a triple, for example, because that's in terms of like a cubic scheme. It went from 3 to 1. This one goes from 1 to 3. So let's say we had a triple here. More than likely, we'll have ascending squats at RP, or I should say rep count of 6. So let's say we have 3x6, and then it would be ascending that top set of 6. So that last set of 6 would still be around 82.5 to 85% in relation to the primary squat here. So that percentage just resonated well with Ben, let's say, like I kind of had to mention, 77.5 to 87.5%, roughly around there, give or take, depending on the athlete, their weight class, their age, etc. External variables, of course. 82.5, was a safe haven in terms of he was able to dial it in towards that primary squat here, and then let's say anything more, it would just leak into like the deadlifts on our secondary days, or even the deadlifts on our primary days here. So yeah, moving on to the bench press here, we have a close grip bench. This would be our tertiary bench day. Our secondary bench day is Monday, and then our quaternary bench day is Tuesday here, before his primary bench day here. So we can take a look at that. Close grip bench here, volume is front loaded. I personally like to have a lot of volume in the day one bench here. It sets up the tonnage for the week that we need in terms of for having the bench being super primed towards the end here. And as you can see here, secondary bench day, a little bit higher intensity in terms of the exposure. So let's say 170 by 4. E1RM, I believe, is run around like 185 to 190 kilos. And he's going to take the 200 kilos, which is not too far off. So E1RM, meaning like if we take four reps of 170, it should feel around 185 to 190 kilos for one rep. And then the tempo bench day here serves as a primer, and also to just maintain overall health in the bench press with the pec and the shoulders. But yeah, something super light. This could be anywhere between like 75 to 80% here of the primary, so it shouldn't be too heavy, but also just something that is also not too light so that he's still able to feel that stimulus. Going into the bench, as you can see here, we don't have anything more than 48 hours of rest between bench presses. So for example, close grip bench here, he'll have a rest, a bench day here, and then this is the bench day right after. Granted, it's also super light for him, and then a rest day here, and then a bench here. So as you can see, there's not really any 2 consecutive days that we go without benching. And if you can see here in terms of the schemes for the bench, I like to have, like I said, volume heavy over here. Secondary bench, something that is close to the exposure for the primary. This one here is, I believe, 85%. Yeah, so 85%. This can go up to something as high as 90 to 92.5%, depending on the lifter, depending on the weight class. And let's say female lifters, obviously, or maybe not be obviously, but can ride a little bit higher towards that top end strength. Damn near matching the primary load towards the end of the week here, depending on like their weight class, of course. But yeah, quaternary bench, like I said, 75, 80%, could be 82.5%, depending on the variation. Let's say if they only have like a 3x4 or a 4x2, kind of just like counting the sets and counting the reps during the week. That's where you can land it here. Or if they're in prep, you can also practice it as you can do like a 2-second pause bench there for people who, let's say, have quick pauses. So yeah, just a little recap here in terms of the squat and bench. The heavier we get in terms of, let's say, like the logistic growth approach here, of course, fatigue is going to be higher because weight is going to be naturally more. So in this type of analogy here, sometimes less is more. He's not doing any crazy volume in terms of like 5, 6, 7 sets on squats, which I've heard many lifters, that are very, every lifter is different, but there are lifters out there that, can squat over 700 pounds that may need 6 or 7 sets going into the primary. But for somebody like Ben, as well as Yuan, who also, squats around 750, I believe, they only need 3 to 5 sets on the secondary, super light exposure, and in this case, less is more. Save a lot of fatigue, and then heading into the primary, you'll be able to put your best foot forward there. But of course, like I said, stay around that percentage range so that you'll be still fully primed going into the primary squat. All right, and last but not least, let's go ahead and take a look at the deadlifts here. Similar to the squat, it's a lower body movement, right? So this percentage here is 82.5. Like I said, we'll cap it around 85 to 87.5% on the secondary days in relation to the primary later on in the week. Competition deadlift, we'll have it around 80%. I do this for myself. I do this for a lot of my lifters. I don't like to ride too high in terms of the deadlift exposure here. Deadlift, out of all the 3 lifts, doesn't need as much exposure. Bench is the first one that kind of you can ride a little bit higher, so it goes bench, squat, and then deadlift. You even have cases where people would deadlift or may not even have like a secondary deadlift. Let's say they deadlift 1 time a week, and that's enough exposure for them to get the deadlift from the previous week. In this case, 80%, so 247.5 kilos here. That will prime them enough for 310. Or we can even take a look at the week before. So 232.5 kilos, 80% of that primary, it's going to come down to 290. So on the secondary deadlift days, he does have a belt on. He pulls conventional. Some other lifters, let's say they need to be more in extension, they may need to go into beltless. But yeah, this is a conventional puller as well, so that's something to keep in mind. Conventional naturally has a higher fatigue load compared to sumo, so the rep range or the volume is a little bit lower. Let's say we have a drop down 2x5 with sumo. I mean, you can go all the way up towards like 6 or 7 reps on the drop downs, or even perhaps even the top set having a higher rep count here. But a triple, perfectly fine, perfectly good enough for him. Even like a double, for example, for the 80% would be just enough for him to prime for the 310. You don't want to go too heavy in terms of the conventional work here because, of course, there's a lot of lower back fatigue, and that's the last thing we want to do when we're doing heavy lifts towards the end of the week here. Similar to the bench, I know we kind of mentioned, we're not going 48 hours without benching. Squat and deadlift, on the other hand, let's say lower body rest time is a little bit greater. So as you can see here, his secondary squat and deadlift day was on Sunday, and there's about 3 days or 72 hours before our primary SBD day here. So there's 3 days of full lower body rest time before we go ahead and on our legs again, and then 48 hours from after our SBD day going into the secondary day here. That's kind of how we leave it streamlined. I do the same. I know Coach Joe does the same as well. Yeah, I mean, you're throwing around all these heavy weights, like I said. Coming to this part here, it's a lot less leeway in terms of getting away with being able to tack on a lot of lifts, a lot of heavy lifts during the week and towards the next week. For intermediate lifters or even newer lifters, in terms of like the noob gains and things like that, you can get away with higher frequency during the week, and it might even be necessary in terms of for those lifters, because they're not going as heavy. Fatigue is recovered much quicker, whereas onset fatigue for someone who's, let's say, squatting 300 kilos, benching 200 kilos, the fatigue is going to definitely last a little bit longer, or not a little bit, a lot longer. So. But yeah, just a little quick recap in terms of the case study here. He has 4 times bench, squatting and deadlift 2 times. We kind of covered a little bit between 2 or 3 times squat. So I guess a good question here would be, where is the best route when a lifter needs to go from 3 times squat to 2 times squat, or even like increase their bench frequency from 3 to 4 or down from 4 to 3. You kind of look at fatigue levels. You got to look at energy levels. You got to look at potential room of injury if the athlete is redlining, things like that. So in this case scenario, 4 times bench worked very well for him. 3 times wasn't enough stimulus going to that primary bench. So when is it a good time to reroute to, let's say, a different frequency, or reroute to a different type of percentage, whatever it may be? On our end, what we kind of look at is if there is a trend of a 2 times downward motion. So for example, if he is doing 3 times benching, right? This is obviously 4 times, but let's say we went from 3 to 4. If we had 3 times benching and we noticed that the primary bench day wasn't as strong, 2 blocks in a row, then from that point on, it's time for a change. 1 block is not enough time. 2 times, I wouldn't say it's plenty, but it's definitely good data for, it's like, okay, maybe we need to pivot somewhere else and change something little. I know there was a whole approach thing with like a 6-time SBD. Not going to dive right into that, but I mean, those guys will stick it out for like 4, 5, 6 blocks or something like that, perhaps even longer. But in this case, a good rule of thumb, fundamentally speaking, if there's 2 downward trends, that's when we can look towards a slight shift somewhere. Yeah, so that's just a quick case study here of athlete Bin Lee and how we got his 780 kilo total all the way up to 862.5. I think it's very important, for, I would say, not even just like newer lifters, but let's say intermediate advanced lifters, to understand that lifting, powerlifting, strength training is an allogistic growth approach, where at a certain point it's going to be hard to develop progress as we had compared to in the beginning, and being able to kind of make it very niche towards you. Every athlete is built different. Every lifter responds differently to different stimulus. What works for you may not work for somebody else, and then vice versa. So yeah, this is just kind of a quick rundown for Bin here. A little bit of background about him. He's a 93 kilo lifter and representing Team China in that weight class. But yeah, where to find us? P4P Coaching on YouTube, Instagram. My Instagram is @PhilStrong. Coach Joe, who's also the other coach at P4P, Joe.Bornstein over there. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to DM the page or comment down below.